They called her a peacetime vet, and that label carried its own kind of quiet dismissal. It sounded respectful, sure, but underneath, it implied something else, something smaller. It said, you were there, but not really. It said, you served, but you were lucky enough not to see the real thing. It was a phrase people used when they didn't know what else to say, when they wanted to sound grateful without having to ask questions. For her, it was a reminder that sometimes the deepest scars didn't come from open combat, but from the long stretches of silence between it. She learned to read the tone behind the phrase, the slight pause before someone said it, the polite half-smile that followed. It wasn't meant to hurt, but it always did. They didn't know the kind of work she'd done, or the weight of carrying missions that never made the news. They didn't know how many names she still remembered, or how many coordinates she still saw when she closed her eyes. Peacetime vet became shorthand for invisible. It was a label that made her easier to understand, easier to categorize, easier to forget. The truth was that peacetime wasn't always peaceful. It was filled with operations that blurred the lines between diplomacy and danger, where every move was quiet and every mistake could still cost lives. She wasn't in the spotlight. She was in the shadows, running reconnaissance that shaped decisions others would never know about. When people thought of veterans, they imagined uniforms and medals, not encrypted briefings in windowless rooms, not reconnaissance in neutral zones that weren't as neutral as they looked. She did her job, and she did it well, but it wasn't the kind of service people told stories about. So when she came home, she carried that label because it was easier than explaining, easier than saying she couldn't talk about what she'd done, easier than admitting that even without a declared war, she'd spent years navigating the edge of one. People liked clear lines, heroes and civilians, war and peace, but her story didn't fit neatly into either side. And in a world that runs on quick labels, being unclassifiable was a kind of exile. When people thanked her for her service, she smiled, because that's what you do. You don't correct them. You don't tell them that peacetime doesn't mean safety. You don't say that sometimes the missions that never make it into history books are the ones that rewrite the future anyway. You just nod and accept the gratitude, because it's not really for you. It's for the idea of you, the version that fits comfortably into their understanding of what service means. She noticed the difference in how people looked at her versus others who'd been deployed into combat zones. There was a certain gravity that came with combat status, a kind of unspoken authority. She didn't resent it. She respected it. But she also knew that bravery takes more than bullets. Sometimes it's the courage to stay invisible, to do work that might never be acknowledged. Sometimes it's walking through years of quiet, carrying knowledge that would never be spoken aloud. Peacetime demanded its own kind of endurance, one that didn't leave visible wounds but still left something aching underneath. There were moments when she'd hear stories, loud, public stories, about battles and medals, and she'd feel both proud and apart. She'd remember the cold stillness of certain nights, the tension in coded transmissions, the times when she had to make choices without waiting for permission. She'd remember the people who never got mentioned, the ones who operated between the official lines. She'd remember what it meant to be told her service mattered, but only in theory. Peacetime vet. It had a way of softening her reality, sanding off the sharp edges of what she'd actually lived. People liked to believe peace was a clean break, that it came after the chaos and restored order. They didn't see that peace often depended on the quiet chaos of people like her, working unseen to keep it intact. They didn't see the strain of constant readiness, the kind that never makes headlines because it's supposed to prevent them. She didn't need applause. She never did. But there was something about the word, peacetime, that erased too much. It turned service into symbolism. It made her invisible even while being thanked. It made her story sound smaller than it was. That label followed her into interviews, doctor's appointments, social circles. Every time it came up, it carried a tone that said, you were lucky. Maybe she was. But luck wasn't what kept her alive. It was training, instinct, and a kind of loyalty that ran deeper than duty. What people missed was that the quiet kind of service, the kind wrapped in confidentiality and carried out under the radar, often left the heaviest marks. It required you to live with everything you couldn't say, to shoulder memories that no one else could validate. It required the strength to keep going even when your story would never be told, when your name would never appear on a list, when your work would be buried under classified files that would stay sealed for decades. And still, she showed up, day after day, for a peace that wasn't quite peace. In a world that didn't quite understand what she'd given for it, the Marshal wasn't supposed to notice. It was just a routine checkpoint, a standard ID scan before entering the facility. She'd done it 100 times before, passing through scanners and security gates without a second glance. Her credentials were clean, her posture calm, her expression neutral in the way veterans learn to wear their faces, composed, unreadable, steady. But that day, something shifted. The Marshal took her ID, flipped it over, and for a brief second, his eyes narrowed. It wasn't suspicion, it was recognition. The kind of recognition that cuts through formality and hits somewhere deeper, almost instinctive. The emblem was small, nearly worn off from years of use, but unmistakable to someone who knew what they were looking at. The Recon Unit seal wasn't a decoration most people would understand. To the untrained eye, it looked like an ordinary insignia, just another symbol buried among the others. But for those who had served in certain circles, it meant something different. It meant clearance, danger, silence. It meant she had been somewhere most people weren't supposed to be. The Marshal's hand paused just slightly before handing her ID back. It wasn't long, maybe a second or two, but she noticed. You always notice pauses like that when you've lived a life built around watching for the smallest tells. His face didn't change much, but there was a flicker behind his eyes, respect, maybe, or realization. Whatever it was, the energy in the room shifted. The routine became personal. She didn't say anything, didn't need to. Years of classified work had taught her the art of saying nothing, of letting silence do the talking. But inside, something old stirred. For so long, that Recon Unit seal had been just another mark on an outdated ID, a trace of a chapter she never discussed. Most people never even saw it, or if they did, they didn't recognize it. But this man did, and that single moment of recognition carried the weight of everything she had kept hidden. The Marshal straightened a little, not in alarm, but in acknowledgement. His tone changed, barely but enough. It went from procedural to measured, from standard protocol to something that carried a touch of reverence. She had seen that tone before, years ago, between people who understood what service without spotlight looked like. There was no salute, no formal gesture, but it didn't need one. Recognition doesn't always come in ceremony. Sometimes it's just two people who know what it means to have lived through the kind of missions no one talks about. She felt an odd calm in that moment, the kind that comes when a truth you've buried for years surfaces, even just a little. The seal was never meant to be seen. It wasn't the kind of mark you flaunted. It was the kind that carried its own warning. Recon meant intelligence, infiltration, observation, roles that required silence long after the mission ended. Her ID was old, nearly due for replacement, but she'd kept it because it reminded her of the version of herself that still existed somewhere beneath the surface. The version that could disappear into a crowd, blend into a story that wasn't hers, carry out a task without leaving a trace. Now, standing there with the Marshal's eyes on the seal, she felt the gravity of everything that symbol meant. It wasn't pride. It was something quieter, more complicated. It was the acknowledgement that what she did had mattered, even if it was never spoken aloud. For years, she had walked through life unnoticed, categorized as a peacetime vet, the harmless title that made people comfortable. But here was someone who saw through it, someone who understood that peacetime doesn't erase what it takes to protect it. The Marshal's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't surprise. It was understanding, the kind that passes between people who have lived by the same unspoken rules. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The seal answered them all. There was a moment of shared silence, respectful, wordless, heavy with the weight of mutual experience. She took her ID back, her fingers brushing the worn edge of the card, feeling the slight indentation where the seal had been pressed years ago. The edges were smooth from use, the lamination beginning to peel, but the symbol remained intact. It always did. Symbols like that don't fade. They just wait for someone who can see them. That moment with the Marshal reminded her that recognition isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, discreet, hidden in the spaces between words. It's a look, a pause, a shift in tone. It's the acknowledgement that someone else knows what it means to carry secrets, to work in shadows, to live with the kind of memories that don't fit neatly into official records. Afterward, nothing dramatic happened. The line behind her kept moving, the gate beeped as it always did, and the day continued like any other. But for her, something subtle had changed. For the first time in a long time, someone had seen the truth behind the title, the story behind the uniform. It wasn't validation she sought. It was connection, the kind that can only exist between those who've walked the same invisible ground. The kind that doesn't need words to be understood. Everyone carries a story they don't tell. Some hide theirs behind silence, some behind smiles, and some behind the kind of calm that only comes from knowing too much. She carried hers in plain sight, hidden beneath an ordinary name tag, a uniform that blended in, and an ID with a symbol most people never noticed. To the world, she was just another veteran, quiet, composed, part of a system that had already moved on. But beneath that surface was a history layered in codes, missions, and choices that didn't fit neatly into the versions people like to hear. Hidden histories have a way of living inside people like that, buried, but never gone. When people looked at her, they saw a professional, disciplined, unremarkable in the way that made others comfortable. They didn't see the years she spent on missions that technically didn't exist. They didn't see the long nights watching through thermal scopes in border zones where peace was fragile and temporary. They didn't see the faces of those she couldn't save or the decisions that had no right answer. The world moves on quickly from the quiet kind of service, the kind that doesn't have footage or medals attached to it. Those stories vanish into sealed files and whispered reports, but they stay alive in the people who live them. Her hidden history wasn't glamorous. It was built from repetition, patience, and the art of knowing when not to act. Recon work was like that. No glory, no spotlight, just the constant demand to see everything and say nothing. It taught her to move unnoticed, to read danger in the smallest details, to make peace with being unseen. Over time, she became fluent in silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from fear, but the kind that comes from necessity. It was how she protected herself, how she honored the people she worked with, how she lived with everything she couldn't say. There's a strange kind of loneliness that comes with that kind of life. You learn to navigate conversations carefully, to measure how much truth people can handle. When someone asks about your service, you give the short version. You talk about locations, maybe dates, but not the work itself. You strip your story down to the parts that sound normal, safe, easy to digest. The rest you keep locked away because it's too complicated to explain to people who've never lived it. And eventually, that becomes second nature. You stop expecting anyone to understand what you've seen. You start living with the idea that your real history will always exist somewhere out of reach. Sometimes, she'd catch herself watching others the way she used to watch from the field, scanning for patterns, for threats that weren't there. It was instinct, muscle memory from a version of herself that never really retired. Even in everyday life, she still moved with quiet precision, as if every moment could turn into something else without warning. That's what happens when you've spent years living behind layers of secrecy. It changes how you see everything. It changes how you move through the world. Hidden histories don't always stay buried. They resurface in small ways, in the way someone reacts to a sudden noise, in the way they freeze when they hear a certain phrase, in the way they always choose the seat facing the exit. They show up in habits that seem ordinary but are born from something deeper. People call it training, but it's more than that. It's memory that never fully fades, coded into reflex. It's a reminder that the line between peace and conflict isn't as wide as people think. When the Marshal recognized the seal on her ID, it was more than just a symbol being noticed. It was a piece of her hidden history being brought to light. For years, that part of her life had existed like a shadow she carried quietly, something unacknowledged but ever-present. Having it seen, even briefly, disrupted the comfortable invisibility she had built. It reminded her that history doesn't disappear just because no one talks about it. It lives in the silence, waiting for the right moment to be recognized. People like her live in two worlds: the visible one where they go to work, pay bills, make small talk, and the invisible one built from memory, loyalty, and the unspoken weight of what they've done. Most will never know the tension of carrying both at once, of sitting through an ordinary conversation while a different kind of story hums quietly beneath the surface. Hidden histories make you cautious. They teach you to move carefully, to guard what you know, to live as if your own past might be misunderstood if ever revealed. There's a kind of dignity in that invisibility, but also a quiet ache. She never wanted fame, never wanted recognition, but she did want to be seen, not as a symbol, not as a stereotype, but as a whole person who had lived through something real. The world likes to separate heroes and ordinary people, but she knew better. Most of the heroes she'd known never called themselves that. They just did their jobs and disappeared back into the quiet, leaving behind stories that would never be told. Her hidden history wasn't something she was ashamed of, but it wasn't something she flaunted either. It was a truth too heavy to hand to someone who hadn't earned the right to hold it. So she kept it close, carried it in her posture, in her silence, in the way she noticed things others missed. It was a private reminder of who she had been, and who she still was beneath the surface of what everyone else saw. Service doesn't always end when the uniform comes off. Sometimes, it lingers quietly in the body, in the mind, in the spaces between breaths. The cost of service isn't measured in visible wounds or medals pinned to a chest. It's measured in the nights that stretch too long, in the quiet thoughts that won't let go, in the weight of everything done in the name of duty that no one else remembers. For her, the cost came not from combat, but from the years spent preparing for it, living in a constant state of readiness that never fully shut off. Even in peacetime, there were missions, responsibilities, and the pressure to perform as if war could break out at any second. That kind of vigilance leaves marks you can't see. People think peacetime means safety. They imagine calm bases, administrative work, training exercises, and paperwork. They picture order and stability, not tension. But peacetime in her world was built on uncertainty. It was about maintaining control in unstable regions, reading between lines that others missed, and knowing that one miscalculation could start something irreversible. There was no applause for preventing chaos, no recognition for the crises that never happened because someone like her caught them early. The work demanded precision, patience, and a tolerance for pressure that most people would crumble under. That pressure doesn't fade when the job ends. It settles in quietly, in the form of habits you can't break. She still woke up before dawn, still scanned crowds without thinking, still sat with her back to the wall. Her friends laughed about how alert she was, how she never missed a detail, but they didn't understand that it wasn't a skill, it was a survival mechanism. Peacetime service meant being always on alert for something that might never come, and that kind of readiness takes something from you. You start to forget what it feels like to truly relax, to live without scanning for exits or calculating outcomes. The cost also showed up in her relationships. She had a way of holding back, of keeping a part of herself out of reach. It wasn't intentional, it was learned behavior. When you've spent years separating what can be said from what can't, it becomes natural to compartmentalize everything. She could be present without being open, engaged without revealing too much. People noticed her calmness, her composure, and called it strength. They didn't see the exhaustion that came from maintaining it. They didn't see the constant balancing act between being part of the world and keeping her distance from it. There was a certain loneliness to that. Peacetime veterans live in a strange space where their service doesn't fit the usual narrative. They don't have battle stories to tell, no combat wounds to show. Their experiences are harder to explain, harder to validate. Society knows how to thank soldiers for fighting. It doesn't know how to thank them for waiting, watching, and preventing wars that never happened. The absence of recognition isn't bitterness. It's an emptiness, a quiet ache for understanding that rarely comes. She sometimes wondered if it would have been easier if her service had been more visible, if her sacrifices had left marks people could see. Instead, what she carried was internal, a fatigue that came from years of control, discipline, and silence. There's a mental toll in living with classified truths, in holding memories you can't share. Every detail that had to be forgotten, every name that couldn't be spoken, became part of a mental archive she couldn't delete. It wasn't trauma in the conventional sense, it was accumulation. A slow layering of weight that pressed down over time. The world often confuses peacetime with ease, but it takes effort to maintain peace. It takes constant vigilance, quiet endurance, and an ability to handle moral gray areas without flinching. She had to make decisions that didn't fit the clean categories of right and wrong. She had to trust instincts over orders at times, knowing that no one would ever officially acknowledge the choices she made. That's another cost. Living with the consequences of actions that were necessary but invisible. Even after she left the service, that invisible cost followed her. It was in the way she hesitated before answering questions about her past, in the way she struggled to connect with people who lived uncomplicated lives. She wanted to explain that peacetime service wasn't peaceful at all, but the words always felt too heavy, too real. The few who tried to understand often looked at her with confusion, unable to reconcile the calm woman before them with the quiet intensity behind her eyes. It's hard to explain a kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from doing too much, but from never being allowed to stop. She'd learned to live with it, to channel it into structure, into precision, into the small rituals that kept her centered. Routine became her anchor. It was the one thing she could control in a world that often felt unpredictable. But underneath the routine was a restlessness that never left. The feeling that peace was temporary, that calm was a pause, not a conclusion. It wasn't paranoia, it was conditioning. The kind of conditioning that comes from knowing too well how quickly things can change, how fragile stability really is. The cost of service that doesn't make headlines isn't dramatic or cinematic. It's quieter, more insidious. It lives in the gap between who you were and who you have to become to survive afterward. It's the slow process of trying to live in a world that no longer requires your vigilance, while your mind refuses to believe that true recognition isn't always about medals or ceremonies. Sometimes it's about a look, a pause, a subtle shift in how someone says your name. For years, she had grown used to polite acknowledgments that felt rehearsed, thank yous that sounded right but landed hollow. People said the words because they were supposed to, not because they understood what they meant. There's a difference between being thanked and being seen. She didn't need the applause, but she longed for the kind of recognition that came from genuine understanding. The kind that said, I know what it costs to carry that kind of silence. The Marshal's recognition had felt different. It wasn't loud or performative. It was quiet, grounded, real. He didn't look at her like she was a symbol. He looked at her like someone who understood the weight of what that seal represented. That moment reminded her how rare real recognition is for people like her, for those who served in ways that don't fit the popular image of a soldier. Most people imagine war as something visible, uniforms in the field, gunfire, loss, victory. But her version of service existed in the shadows between those images. She had operated in spaces where success meant staying unseen, where the best outcome was that no one ever knew what almost happened. It's hard to recognize someone for preventing a disaster that never occurred. There are no headlines for what doesn't happen, no medals for missions that stay classified. And yet, those unseen efforts often decide the shape of history. That's what she carried, the knowledge that her work mattered, even if the world would never know how. Recognition, for her, wasn't about external validation. It was about knowing someone else could see the truth of her story without needing an explanation. Respect is a word people throw around easily, but few understand what it really means in the context of service. True respect isn't just gratitude, it's comprehension. It's acknowledging the complexity, the contradictions, the cost. It's understanding that not all sacrifices are visible and not all wounds bleed. People like her walk through life carrying that duality. They're both honored and forgotten at the same time. Society thanks them but doesn't know how to talk to them. They're remembered in slogans but overlooked in conversation. Recognition that only exists on paper isn't recognition at all. She learned to stop expecting it. Over time, she accepted that most people would never fully understand what her service entailed. They would smile, shake her hand, say the right words, and move on. It wasn't their fault. They simply couldn't see the layers beneath the surface. But every once in a while, someone did. Someone who'd served in silence too, or someone who'd lived close enough to understand the language of restraint. That was enough. Those rare moments of unspoken acknowledgement meant more than any ceremony could. What she wanted, more than anything, was honesty. Not pity, not glorification, just the truth. The truth that service comes in many forms, that peacetime isn't the same as safety, that the people who protect peace often pay for it quietly and alone. She wanted people to know that valor isn't always forged in fire. Sometimes it's built in silence, in patience, in endurance. The kind of valor that doesn't seek recognition but still deserves it. The problem with the way society recognizes veterans is that it's built around visibility. If you don't fit the image of a hero, you're placed on the margins. You become a footnote, a lesser version of sacrifice. She saw that happen all the time to analysts, medics, engineers, reconnaissance officers, people whose work held everything together from behind the scenes. Their stories didn't make for good sound bites, so they stayed untold. Recognition, in the traditional sense, is often reserved for the visible moments of courage, but she knew that the invisible ones carried just as much weight. Sometimes, recognition means being able to speak and be believed. For her, that was rare. The things she could talk about seemed insignificant without context, and the things that mattered most couldn't be spoken at all. So she lived between those two realities, in a silence that most people mistook for calm. When the Marshal noticed the seal, it broke that silence just enough to remind her that she wasn't erased. Someone still knew. Someone still remembered what that symbol stood for. Respect, in its truest form, is simple. It's the quiet acknowledgement that a person's experience has depth, even if you can't fully grasp it. It's the willingness to listen without trying to categorize or compare. She didn't need anyone to put her on a pedestal. She just wanted to exist in her truth without it being minimized by assumptions or stereotypes. Recognition isn't about the size of the stage. It's about the sincerity of the gaze. It's about being looked at as a whole person, not as an archetype. For her, that single moment at the gate, when the Marshal paused and really saw her, carried more weight than any public honor ever could. It wasn't grand, but it was genuine. And for someone who'd lived her life unseen, that kind of recognition was rare enough to feel sacred. It was the kind of respect that didn't need to be spoken aloud, the kind that said everything in silence. Valor has always been defined in narrow terms. Battlefield courage, visible danger, acts of defiance under fire. People imagine it as a moment of glory, a single decision in the heat of chaos that separates heroes from everyone else. But for her, valor was different. It wasn't a moment. It was a way of existing. It was waking up every day and doing her job knowing no one would ever know what she did. It was carrying responsibility without recognition, sacrifice without ceremony. Valor, for her, was steady, patient, and quiet. It lived in the details, in the choices made when no one was watching, in the promises kept when no one would ever find out if she broke them. She had seen what traditional valor looked like. She'd trained alongside soldiers who'd seen combat, who bore the marks of it on their skin and in their eyes. She respected them deeply, never once comparing her experience to theirs. But she also knew that courage took many forms. There was courage in the stillness, in the waiting, in the act of holding ground when action could make things worse. There was valor in discipline, in self-control, in the refusal to take credit for something you could never speak of. The world celebrates the visible, but she learned early that the unseen acts of bravery often hold everything together. During her years in the Recon Unit, she saw countless examples of it. The intelligence officer who stayed awake for 72 hours straight to monitor a situation that could have spiraled into war. the field specialist who volunteered for the most dangerous observation posts, knowing she'd never be mentioned in a single report. The liaison who negotiated peace behind closed doors, absorbing the tension of nations so others could sleep at night. None of them would ever be known publicly. Their valor existed in shadows, unrecorded, but real all the same. That kind of courage rarely earns medals. It earns quiet nods, half-acknowledged respect from those who understand what it takes to live without credit. She thought about that often after she left. The world loves the idea of heroes but struggles to see them when they don't fit the mold. People want stories with clear beginnings and endings, victories they can cheer for, villains they can point at. But the truth she lived was far more complicated. Valor wasn't about defeating anyone. It was about holding the line between chaos and control. It was about keeping the world steady, even when no one knew it was tilting. It was about doing the right thing when the only reward was knowing you did it. Redefining valor meant reclaiming the idea from spectacle and returning it to its essence. She believed valor lived in the small things, the unseen decisions that protected lives, the restraint that prevented conflict, the empathy that kept missions human. It wasn't about domination or destruction. It was about discipline, responsibility, and service without ego. In her world, valor looked like paperwork done meticulously because an error could cost lives. It looked like hours spent decoding data that might avert a crisis. It looked like patience, endurance, and humility. When people called her a peacetime vet, they meant it as a compliment softened by ignorance. They couldn't imagine valor existing without violence. To them, peace was passive, a break between battles. But she knew better. Peace required vigilance. Peace demanded people like her. People willing to act quietly, strategically, without expectation of recognition. That was its own kind of courage. To live your life preparing for a war that never comes and still give everything you have to prevent it. That takes strength most people never have to find. Valor also meant honesty. Not the kind spoken aloud, but the kind you keep with yourself. The honesty to admit fear, to recognize limits, to keep showing up even when no one would notice if you didn't. It meant standing by your choices long after the mission ended, carrying the moral weight of them without flinching. She understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was moving forward with fear fully present. It was learning to live with it, to use it, to let it sharpen rather than paralyze. The hardest part of redefining valor was that no one wanted to hear about the quiet kind. It didn't fit into ceremonies or documentaries. There were no flags raised for restraint, no songs written about patience. But the truth was, the world depended on it. Every headline avoided, every crisis diffused, every life spared existed because of people who practiced that kind of valor. She was one of them. And even though her name would never be known for it, she found comfort in knowing she had been part of something that mattered, something bigger than applause. Valor, in her eyes, was not about recognition but about integrity. It was about doing what's right when no one is watching and still doing it when the consequences hurt. It was about quiet conviction, about showing grace under pressure, about walking through the world knowing your contribution will never be celebrated but choosing to make it anyway. That was the version of valor she lived by. The version that didn't need to be seen to be real. The version that didn't end when the mission was over, but continued in every ordinary moment afterward. The version that existed not for glory, but for peace.